in the chat box. We're not going to get to them immediately, but I'll be keeping tabs on them and make sure that Vanessa sees them when we get to the Q&A portion. So thank you all for being here. And Vanessa, all you.
Well, thank you so much, Lex, and thank you, Dan, for being an organizer as well. Jewish Live is pretty remarkable. I've never done a virtual book launch before, and this is incredible right now. It's incredible to see my friends from Tel Aviv, from Dublin, from Washington, D.C., from New Jersey, from Charlottesville, wonderful Charlottesville people. Hello to Emily Filler, to Laura Levitt, to Linda Katz, to Eunice Kaplan, to Joni, to Maya, so many people. Sounds like romper room in the olden days when the teacher would see everybody. It's wonderful to be here together with all of you. And I'm very excited to share this new book. It came out so beautifully. The folks at Princeton University Press really did a beautiful job in the production of this book. And what I'd like to do this afternoon is share a little bit of the book with you, share some stuff that's in the book and some stuff that isn't. But I want to begin with a story that took place at the beginning of my research. And so I'll read a little bit. When I began to think hard about the life of the Haggadah in preparation for this biography, Rabbi Lawrence Hoffman, who has written extensively on this text, suggested I go to Chicago to meet with Stephen Derschlag, the premier private collector of printed Haggadot in America. I'm glad I did, because shortly after my arrival, I learned how the Haggadah lived in a distinctive way. The father of anthropological fieldwork is Malinowski, who distinguished himself from the armchair anthropologists of the 19th century by leaving home and going into the field for an extended period of time to live among the people who would be his objects of study. In those days, they were invariably called the natives. Malinowski's description of his arrival in Melanesian New Guinea is well known. Imagine, he wrote, suddenly set down, surrounded by your gear, alone on a tropical beach, close to a native village, while the launch or dinghy which has brought you sails away out of sight. The entrance story foreshadows the anthropologist's transformation from stranger to insider. It also hints at an essential understandings that will be revealed. While anthropologists today rarely claim that they become insiders, performing fieldwork remains their primary research method and is the profession's initiation rite. They tell entrance stories. So nodding to Malinowski, I preface this biography with my own. I arrived at the shore of Lake Michigan, neither by launch nor by dinghy, but by car. This was Chicago's Gold Coast, and I stood in front of the grand building where Mr. Derschlag, who had invited me to call him Steve, lived, hoping I was presentable. It was unusually sunny and a hot fall day. When I entered his modern art-filled apartment overlooking the city and the lake, he graciously offered me a drink. Water, I said, will be lovely. I felt awe and excitement as Steve ushered me into his wood-shelved library where his Haggadot were housed. Rare ones were there on the shelves, not even behind glass, but placed along with his other books, even paperbacks. He selected treasures to show me, rapidly placing one on top of the next on a glass display table in the center of the room. Here was the 1629 Venice Haggadah, the 1695 Amsterdam Haggadah, and now the 1712 Amsterdam with its folded up map of the biblical world. I could hardly keep up. Steve didn't insist that I coddle each Haggadah on a special foam rest, as I had in libraries' rare book collections. This was liberating. But what if I stressed the bindings? He didn't ask me to put on those special white gloves that the special collections librarians made me wear. I could have been perusing my own very modest shelf of stacked up Haggadahs in my living room, a collection rich in the supermarket and Maxwell House coffee ad Haggadahs that my mother had amassed over the years, not as examples of ephemera, but for us to use. I was anxious for the safety of Steve's books. Didn't they need a more watchful eye, some protection, say from me? Distracting myself from these worrisome thoughts, I asked Steve how he had found his Haggadot, thinking he might have some miraculous discovery stories. He answered by matter-of-factly pulling out a Sotheby's catalog, and then one from Kestenbaum's from his shelves. He pointed to a new purchase that was still in an unopened padded mailer, and he said more new ones were on their way. The tower of Haggadot he was putting on the table for me grew higher and higher. Haggadot from Pune, Paris, South Africa, Shanghai, Melbourne, Munich. He declared it was time to clear off this batch to make space for others. Inebriated by gratitude, to be present to witness this wondrous collection, I enthusiastically stretched out my right arm over the books on the table, ready to help sweep them up so I could see even more Haggadot. I failed to notice that on this hot day, Steve had also gotten himself a drink, a bottle of Diet Cola, and it had been on the table all along, and it was uncapped. Now, thanks to my outstretched arm, it was spilling all over the table of Haggadot. I prayed, oh dear God, if the soda damages just the Sotheby's catalog, that would be enough. Dayenu. Or just the Sotheby's and also the Kestenbaums. Even that would be enough. I started to turn towards Steve, anticipating the horror and displaying my shame. But during my liturgical interlude, he had dashed off and returned with what he called a shmata, a little rag. He was already clearing, dabbing, mopping, reassuring me, you cannot treat them as artifacts or they lose their value. That is when I understood that while an individual Haggadah may be collected and cherished for its historical or artistic merits, it lives as its most authentic self when it is used, especially on a family's Passover Seder table. That is when it gets a life, so to speak. In the presence of its vulnerability, subject to wine spills and the assault of matzah crumbs, it choreographs the transmission of particular memories and inculcates sensibilities. I would go on to learn that a Haggadah comes to life when it leads those who have gathered to ask hard questions about slavery, exile, redemption, and freeing the oppressed. Its liveliness increases each time it is taken out again to be used at a Seder, and each time celebrants use it. It's especially lively, but in a different way, when it fades into the background and gives rise to the conversation of those seated at the table who are alive at the present moment and make telling the Passover story meaningful for themselves. I'm grateful to Fred Appel from Princeton University Press for asking me to take on the topic of the Passover Haggadah for this series on great sacred texts. I did not realize at the time how crazy an assignment it was. Other people took on Genesis, Exodus. There are over 6,000 versions of the Haggadah. It meant that I had a great deal to learn. And any detail in the book that is correct, it's thanks to Rabbi Larry Hoffman, who gave me many pointers. And any mistake, I take full credit for. I did want to think a lot about, in the course of my studies of the Haggadah, I wanted to think about why it had to be written and rewritten so many times. And I came up with a scenario, one that I tried out on my friend Michal Kravel-Tovi, who's still awake in Tel Aviv right now. So let me try this scenario with you as well. Say you have never attended a Passover Seder, but like other intrepid souls, you decide to hold one in your home. You invite guests, or I suppose this year, virtual guests, and you read recipes. You know there's a book, the Haggadah, that tells you what to do and say. You know that it's in Hebrew, but there are English translations. You go to Amazon online. You find an affordable one with meaningful explanations, contemporary readings, scholarly digressions, musical notes for a few songs, visual images that appeal to you, and instructions for how to arrange your Seder table. And then you go back online and you order some used copies to offer your guests or your virtual guests. You, in the olden days, you would cook your heart out. Now you might just get some cream cheese to put on your matzah. And you turn to the instructions in the front of the Haggadah, which tells you what goes on the Seder plate. You do not know what a shank bone is, so you use the vegetarian alternative your Haggadah suggests, a beet. You pick up matzahs and macaroons at Wegmans, or you have them delivered, and you have wine delivered from Trader Joe's. Come the eve of Passover, you and your guests take turns reading the Haggadah. What it says, you do. Bless, you bless. Dip the parsley in salt water, you dip. All the guests are already whining, let us say now together, when do we eat? As if it were part of the liturgy. Only midway, as your Haggadah instructs, do you serve the festive meal. Some guests lobby for stopping at that point, and this takes you by surprise. It's a religious ceremony, isn't it? But you press on, making it through to the end, with only some skipping of the long psalms. You feel smug when you recite the words of the final poem added in the 11th century, we have concluded the Passover Seder according to law and custom. Though a novice, you have facilitated one of Judaism's most complex ceremonies. You declare your Haggadah a perfect guide and companion. Time passes. Each subsequent year, you hold a Seder using your Haggadah, and it reliably gets the job done. But your guests never seem to really grasp the Exodus story from the text, and they never seem engaged with the ritual. You do not intend to abandon your Haggadah for a dramatic reading from Exodus, which is something my father-in-law once did when he got frustrated with the level of ignorance at his Seder table. You trace the problem you were having to your particular Haggadah, the one you had selected, and you plan to scout out a better one. If the year had been, say, 2015, there were new choices to be made. The Lieberman Open Orthodox Haggadah, the Unorthodox Haggadah, a festival of freedom and springtime in 15 innings. In 2019, if you purchased a huge container of a Maxwell House product with Amazon Prime, you could have gotten a pink, marvelous Mrs. Maisel Haggadah with an index card with her brisket recipes. And here is the recipe for brisket inside. And so you won't be disappointed. Here is the Maxwell ad on the back. You look at fancy facsimile editions and find yourself contemplating how many artists since the Middle Ages have been motivated to try their hands at illuminating the Haggadah according to the styles and tastes of their era. This makes sense to you. What perplexes you is why so many different versions of the text have emerged, not just in one particular year, and not just of late, but over the generations. In fact, a small cottage industry of Haggadah bibliographies emerged, at least since 1901, when there were only 909. And now, whenever figures are cited, the number is usually 6,000 and counting. Now, in addition to the facsimiles, reprints, and photo offsets, the number now includes thousands of unique, community-tailored, photocopied, handmade versions. Homemade Haggadahs, many created with the help of the website haggadot.com, are copied at Staples. As a matter of fact, there are people I've met recently who have a ritual where they get it done just the day before Pesach, and then they see their friends at Staples all Xeroxing together. It's an ingathering of the people. Some people are displaying their Haggadot as PowerPoints projected onto the dining room wall or downloaded on tablets, electronic readers, and on mobile phones. And yes, this year, people will say, please go to my chat room, to the chat box, and press the link, and you will find the Haggadah I've prepared for you. Some Haggadahs recognize that the attention span of adults attending Seders has been reduced to the duration of a TV sitcom. That's the 30-minute Haggadah. Then there is Michael Rubiner's 2-minute Haggadah, a Passover service for the impatient, which appeared in Slate in 2006. And I just want to read a snippet of that. The story of Passover. It's a long time ago. We're slaves in Egypt. Pharaoh is a nightmare. We cry out for help. God brings plagues upon the Egyptians. We escape, bake some matzah. We wander 40 years in the desert, eat manna, get the Torah, wind up in Israel, get a new temple, enjoy several years without being persecuted again. Let the brisket cool now. So let me ask, why is it that there have been so many Haggadot, so many versions? The experts generally agree that there are 3 reasons. Geography is the first reason. Jews have lived all over the world, and the Haggadah may be recited in any language, for the goal of its transmission is understanding. It's been translated into English, Yiddish, Judeo-Italian, Judeo-Spanish, French, Spanish, Russian, Polish, Chinese, Italian, Croatian, Danish, Czech, Finnish, Turkish, Swedish, Hungarian, Amharic, and Marathi, and others. Many Haggadot had multiple languages. For instance, Jews who settled in the Chinese city of Kaifeng had one that included Hebrew, Aramaic, Chinese, and Judeo-Persian. So the second reason for the diversity is Jewish practice. Different versions of the Haggadah have reflected the diversity of liturgical rites among Jews. Choosing from contemporary diversity in America alone, one can point to the Haggadot created for the Reformed, Conservative, Orthodox Sephardic, ultra-Orthodox, Hasidic, renewal, humanistic, and secular Jews, as well as for those describing themselves as non-denominational or post-denominational. And within the sects, there are revisions and unrevisions. A recent new version of the Reform Movement's Union Haggadah, which took out the 10 plagues, initially put them back in. The third answer is history. The Haggadah has expanded to register the events, crises, and cataclysms that have been assimilated into the story that Jews tell about themselves. Thus, the text has been recontextualized by history, by a people who script their annual ritual of nationhood around it. Contemporary examples, a Haggadah written during the Holocaust, whose nightmarish illustrations reflect concentration or DP camps, makes this point. Certainly, the many American or Israeli Haggadot issued after the Six-Day War in 1967 offer celebratory images of Israeli soldiers praying at the Western Wall, or whimsical images of Jerusalem's Old City. And now, Haggadahs express pressing concerns and propose a commitment to action once the Seder is over. Feminism, racism, climate change, the refugee crisis, LGBTQ inclusion, and even a parody for the Trump administration. And of course, you've probably seen online already Haggadot for the virtual Seders, which many of us will be having one that offers a new series of steps for the Haggadah instead of the usual, let's see, do I have this right here? Instead of the usual Kadesh or Chatz Karpas Yachatz. Instead of the usual order, it's make the Kiddush, wash, Barech, wash. After each step, another wash. It was a funny joke when I heard it the first time. I must say, virtual Seder humor has gotten less funny, to tell the truth. And clearly we are all trying to keep our spirits up and feel resilient. And I would say that this particular year, as I think of history and the Haggadah, it may be that the good old fashioned Haggadah really does the trick. We don't need all that much innovation this year because the good old fashioned text says to us, you folks, you have a history of suffering. You have a history of crisis, and you cried out. And you know, you have resources of resilience, and you will make it through. And you will you will pull together, and you will act with compassion, and you will pay particular attention to those who are the neediest. And you will do that because you were in a place of need, great need once yourself. That's what the old story tells us. And of any story that we need to hear now, I think it's that same old story. I think one of the reasons that we have so many Haggadot that put in new problems, new contemporary problems, perhaps it's because we thought of ourselves as being not especially vulnerable, that we weren't needy, we didn't need courage, we didn't need to go back to our story for our own help. And clearly we do very much this year. I want to conclude before we take questions, and I'm really excited to hear your questions. I want to conclude with my own speculation about why is it that we've had to revise the Haggadah so many times. And I would say it's because it's because the Haggadah has imperfections, serious imperfections. The first imperfection I think of as being liturgical. The Seder, the Passover in the time of pilgrimage, in pilgrimage to Jerusalem, was a huge, visceral community event. People were moving from one place to another. They were camping out. There were lambs. There were children running around, and not just your own children. There was the bleating of lambs. There was the sound of the Levites chanting. There was the smell of smoke. It was, as Victor Turner and Edie Turner would say, there was communitas. There was this surge of enthusiasm and togetherness. When pilgrimage to the ancient temple was no longer possible, and when eventually sitting around a table, having a Greco-Roman symposium type meal emerged, that was clearly a stand-in for the real thing. We've been doing that stand-in Seder for so long that it feels to us like the real thing. But sitting around the table and studying and holding up a little shank bone or a beet, it's not the same. It's not the same. It doesn't really altogether compensate for a ritual that I don't want to return and have that long ago ritual, but what stands in for it functions on a highly symbolic level. And unless we are of a highly poetic capacity and we can use our imaginations tremendously, it may not galvanize our spirits sufficiently. The second imperfection is pedagogical. And my colleague Noam Tzion, who along with his colleague David Dishon and then his son Mishael Tzion have created a beautiful series of Haggadot. Noam was the first one who pointed out to me, this is supposed to be a curriculum, a teaching guide, this Haggadah. And truth be told, not every parent who leads a Seder using a Haggadah is an expert teacher. Now, I know many of us have been called to action these days as Zoom teachers for their kids. And we know we're not, unless you're trained as a teacher, it's very hard to use a curriculum, particularly one that might use a series of texts that we are not all that proficient in. The final imperfection is, to me, theological, and I want to read that one. The Haggadah poses a theological challenge without providing sufficient resources to address it. It celebrates a rare moment in the Jewish narrative, God's having liberated the Hebrew slaves who cried out. But even in a celebratory state of mind, and with 4 cups of wine, one struggles to push away a vexing question. Why does God appear to no longer hear the suffering of his children and provide salvation for the majority of Jewish history, starting with the destructions of the temples and the pursuant exiles? What might those reciting the Haggadah in dire periods have concluded when their own cries were not heeded? Were they not also worthy of being rescued as their ancestors enslaved in Egypt were? What amount of prayer, study, and good deeds would it take for God to choose to intervene once again in history and provide salvation before the end of days? And if they were indeed worthy, and the period of penance had concluded, was God no longer able to intervene? The Haggadah does not really engage with such matters, Instead, it frames remembering liberation as a lesson in moral edification. We are grateful for what God did for us once long ago in Egypt. Having been saved ourselves cultivates our empathy for those who are suffering now. We should act in the divine image and attend to their needs. The lesson of gratitude translating into action is an excellent one, but it does not fully distract from the matters of theodicy that have been raised and have not been sufficiently addressed. The imperfections, liturgical, pedagogical, and theological, are sort of hard to see when we look at the Haggadah. They're like the invisible new clothes of the emperor. And one almost wonders, while the Haggadah can readily adjust to changes in logistics, does it maintain its imperfections? Because if they are fully repaired, the Haggadah will cease to be perpetually received as a form that maintains meaningful ties between the present and the past. And just some concluding words. I think this is what Jonathan Safran Foer was getting at when he introduced his 2012 New American Haggadah. He wrote, "The need for a new Haggadah does not imply the failure of existing ones, but the struggle to engage with everyone at the table at a time that is unlike any time that has come before. Like all Haggadahs before it, this one hopes to be replaced. And as you read these words, new Haggadahs are being written." And I can tell you right now, as I say those words, there are many people online right now who are creating virtual Haggadahs. So thank you, everybody. And I'll be really happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Vanessa Ochs. Wonderful, wonderful remarks. Thank you. And so for those of you, I'm not sure what the view is right now, but it might be zoomed in on me. If it is, my background is a picture of the Haggadah, the Passover Haggadah, a biography. And this link here, bit.ly/Haggadah bio, you have to do the right capitalizations there. So capital H in Haggadah, capital B in bio. You can go right there and you can purchase the book. We strongly encourage you to do that. I've read it. It's really, really worth your time. It's really, really worth the amount of money it costs. And there's actually a discount code that Princeton University Press is providing of 30% off if you type in OCHS30, OCHS 30 when you purchase on the Princeton University Press through Princeton University Press. So thank you all so much. We are going to go to our Q&A, and the first question that came in, please continue submitting questions in the chat, and I will be getting to those. The first question we got was, what was the most unexpected experience for you as you researched and wrote this book, as you researched and composed this book? What was unexpected?
It's unexpected. I expected that by the time I finished, I would really understand the Haggadah. And I don't. I've read it hundreds of times. I thought maybe in the end it would cohere in some way for me, and it doesn't. I also thought that maybe let me just see if I can find a piece of paper that I want to share. Let's see. There. I thought maybe I would stop. I would stop being filled with wonder every time I looked at a Haggadah, and I haven't stopped. Each one is just as wondrous to me. And I'll share one of the most beautiful Haggadahs I own, which I got on Etsy somehow or another, is by Tamar Messer. It's absolutely beautiful, and I get to hold it and touch it. It's such a treasure, and it has one of my very favorite illustrations, which if you hold it this way, there is a woman at the head of the Seder table, and if you hold it this way, there's a man at the head of the table. It's just, it's absolutely exquisite and beautiful.
Great. So we've got a couple questions tying that I'm going to roughly synthesize together that are tying your research in the book with your own practice of Passover. So how did this research you did on the Passover Haggadah affect your own Seders?
Well, in the early days, and I worked on this book for a very long time. When I started working on this book, I felt that I had the go-ahead to buy many Haggadot. Not that I didn't already have a bunch, but I felt I could buy even more. And so when guests would come to our Seder, everyone had a Hebrew school Haggadah to use, one that had the yellow and red one with the numbers being, with the lines being numbered. And then everyone else, and everyone also got to pick one of the additional Haggadot that I had. And so we sat around the table with many Haggadot, and it was very cluttered. And I asked people if they could share something from one of the Haggadot that was interesting. And people were showing pictures. Elizabeth would find something meaningful, and Harry and Emma would find a reading that was intriguing to them, the grandchildren, and Isaiah too, but he doesn't read yet. And then it felt too cluttered. So 2 years ago, I made a Charlottesville family Haggadah, which is essentially, it's a traditional Haggadah, but I made it all gender neutral. So there's no he's in it. So it works with my feminist convictions, and it also has some really beautiful poetry in it that my friend Rabbi Dan Alexander introduced to me. And one of the loveliest poems is Passover by Primo Levi, which is an exquisite poem, which if we have time later, I can read it to you. So there's some beautiful poems in it.
Great. Okay, we're getting great questions, and folks, please continue submitting those to the chat box. And if you're watching on Facebook, we're also keeping tabs there if you have questions that you would like to submit via Facebook, even if you're not in the Zoom meeting. So next question, this is more of a specific research kind of question. How did the American 60s change the Haggadah?
Dramatically, absolutely dramatically. Yeah. And this is a shout out. This is a huge shout out to Arthur Waskow, whose Freedom Seder, his Freedom Haggadah, which was created at a tremendously dark time in our country's history. It was after the assassination of Martin Luther King, and Waskow pulled together a Seder of people of many backgrounds. It was a radical Haggadah, and I say that in all the best ways. It showed what a Haggadah could be. It showed that a Haggadah was really about the issues of freedom that we needed to tackle right now in our country. And Waskow set the stage for so many other Haggadot that followed it. And certainly the feminist Haggadot that came not long after, which acknowledged that so many women were not freed from their slavery. They were still in the kitchen, and little girls were in many families not invited to ask the questions. And those feminist Haggadot were name the pains of women who had been excluded. And then eventually those feminist Haggadot included new ritual practices, such as the orange on the Seder plate, such as Miriam's cup. I would say that the women's Haggadah, or the feminist Haggadah, these days has ceased to be as important as it was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And primarily, I would say it's because so many family Haggadot, some of the newly published ones, now include within them a ritual for Miriam's cup or an instruction to put an orange on your Seder plate. So in some ways, it's actually quite wonderful to see the ways that feminism has transformed Jewish American experience, so much so that the rituals that were once new have become de rigueur. And for many, I remember once my granddaughter Emma asked me right before Passover, she said, had I ever heard of the Haggadah? And I said, yeah, I had heard of the Haggadah. And had I ever heard of Miriam's cup? It was like, yeah, I've heard of that. And I was glad she could tell me about it.
That's sensational. Wow. Okay. So one more reminder to folks, keep submitting those questions in the chat box. We are loving the ones that have come in so far. The next one, when and why did some of the key songs of the Passover Seder get added? So for example, Dayenu, fun fact, my father, whose birthday was yesterday, his license plate is Dayenu here on his car. So Dayenu, who knows one, Echad Mi Yodea, Haggadah. When did some of these songs make their way into our Haggadot, and how did that happen?
Those came about in various generations. And certainly one like Hilo Na'eh, Adirhu, they were not necessarily intended as Passover songs even, and they became included. For many of those songs, the dates are truly speculative. So I'm not even gonna try and name those dates. But they became truly beloved and an essential part of what it means to hold a Seder. Certainly in the many families where the Seder stops at the festive meal and the Haggadah gets put away, it will be taken out towards the end for a rendition of Haggadah. And my favorite Haggadah of all time was the one that my son-in-law Taylor did with a puppet, and my nephew Scott did. He was being a different nationality for each verse. It's a very joyous time. But if I want to focus on Haggadah, we laugh and joke and play with that song. It's a highly distressing song. There's an unaccountable amount of death and killing. And while it sort of ends happily, that God vanquishes death itself, there's been a lot of carnage along the way, and not to mention one very sad little boy.
100%. So next question is, so you spoke a bit to, I'll read this word for word. From the asker, I love the way that you spoke of seeing the objects of the collector and how you speak of need for the community that Seder creates that we are longing for this year, especially. Can you say something about the interplay between object and experience?
Oh, that's really quite a beautiful, it's a beautiful question. Hello to all of you who study material culture out there, including some students and former graduate students and undergraduates. We want to hold on to something. We want to hold on to our story. And when we hold the Haggadah in our hands, particularly the Haggadah that it shows the patina of usage, that has the matzah crumbs and it has the wine stains, and it doesn't look as new and pristine as my Tamar Messer put on the shelf Haggadah does. It holds the history of our coming together. It holds the history of our wrestling together. And what I love about the Haggadah texts the ones that so many of us cherish, is come the end of the Seders, they get rubber banded together. And come the end of Passover, they're tossed into a carton or some sort of a container, and they're put in the basement and they're put in the attic, and they're there waiting for us. And when we take them out, we're taking out the history of our family, the history of our people, that sense of it's all coming back, that sense of, well, it's not exactly renewal, because these texts are getting older and shabby, and they're even getting so worn that we might need to get some new ones. But they allow us to know that we're part of a chain of transmission, one that is so strong. So it's the object. The object is a testament to our ability to connect. Yes, we will probably, many of us, have virtual online Haggadot this year, particularly if we're not the people who host Seders, and our usual host is going to invite us to come and provide a digital text. But I'm looking forward to next year, L'Shana Haba'ah, when everyone can hold a text in their hands and really annoy the people on either side of them, and really help them to wash their hands and help bust the dishes. And yeah, I look forward to that.
Me too. So I'm taking a risk here because we have 2 questions left, but but they relate to each other. So I'm going to ask them at once, and as I ask them, I'm going to hope and trust that people submit some more questions, so that we've got more when you finish answering. So these are 2 questions that each tie to the mid 20th century. So the first one is somebody reflecting on their own Seder experience, and also on the wine stains that you mentioned. So I always picture our grandparents' Haggadahs with the wine stains here and there from years past, and our grandfather in his booming voice shouting, "This is the bread of affliction." And this person is wondering about the connections that have been made between that slavery in Exodus and the Holocaust, and how we make sense of God's presence in times of intense affliction. So that's one question. And then the other question is a little bit of a specific kind of question. Are there many Haggadot extant from the World War II camps, from the concentration camps?
Yes, I'm just going to pause for a moment because I wanted to share a particular text. This morning I was going over some of the archives at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Site Museum in Israel, and there are any number of Haggadot and Passover artifacts that have been collected. And there was one that I just wanted to share, this particular one. It doesn't quite answer the question, but I think it gets to maybe the heart of those questions. So there was this family, the Landaus in Poland, and they were cared for by a Christian family. And on Passover, this family allowed the Landaus to kosher their oven and to prepare kosher matzahs from grain that the Landaus were able to grind in a coffee grinder. So the father of the family, Shmaryahu Landau, he recited the text of the Haggadah from memory. And his son, who was then 17, his name was Elimelech, he wrote it down by hand and he decorated it. And we have that text at Yad Vashem. So after the war, Elimelech made his way to Israel, and he arrived in 1945. When he arrived there, he joined the Haganah, and he fought in the War of Independence in the religious battalion. So at Passover time, the battalion was under siege, and Elimelech This time he made a simple Haggadah on a typewriter for the soldiers. And a copy of that Haggadah also survived and is also at Yad Vashem. So these Haggadot from the Holocaust are testimonies to a time when the story would still be told, even if there was no paper. The story would still be told, even if it was a Haggadah from memory. I would say that nowadays, and people might find this interesting, nowadays there is much less reference to the Holocaust in the Haggadah than there used to be, say, in the 80s, when in many communities, nationally, internationally, there was a regular set observance of Yom HaShoah, of Holocaust Remembrance Day, and more liturgies for that day were created. It no longer became as necessary to use the Passover gathering to remember the Holocaust on that particular day. Certainly, if you look at a very beautiful Haggadah, the one that was created by Elie Wiesel, that Haggadah it remains beautiful. That has a great deal of reference to the Holocaust. I would say most Haggadot created now don't have that kind of reference, that kind of elaborate reference.
So this is a question that somebody asked that I've seen popping up in a few forums specifically related to the moment we're facing right now with COVID-19 and social distancing. And specifically, the question is, there are many different people for reasons that I think might be clear, that are referring to COVID-19 as a plague and thinking about comparisons between it and the 10 plagues. Does this, the question is this theologically troubling to you in any way? But I'd ask even more expansively, just how would you relate to the idea of COVID-19 being expressed or related to through the language of a plague?
It's not the same. I think, yes, and yes, it is technically a plague. Is it like the plagues as we teach them in the Haggadah? No, I don't think so. First of all, the plague that the virus that we have right now it's historical. It's happening now. It's actual, and the plagues that we read about in Exodus, these are. They may have happened, I don't know, but they're literary. They function. They function. There's repetition. There's literary devices. Notions of Pharaoh's heart hardening. They come as punishment in the text. They come as punishment. I cannot find it acceptable at all to think of the virus that we now live with as an intentional punishment that is inflicted upon so many people who suffer.
Thank you. So I
on a sober moment.
Yeah, it's an important moment, and yeah, we're all doing our best to find language for where we are right now. But I think it's important to recognize that jumping to that kind of analogy could have some real problematics. So I appreciate you shining a light on that. This is a bit of a gear shift. When it comes to Seder night, which and I think you mentioned a little bit about this, but which Haggadah or Haggadot will you have in front of you? And I guess on one level that's a question for maybe this year, but also more generally, what Haggadah or Haggadot do you have in front of you?
I personally am going to use the Charlottesville 2020 version, which is just it's pretty bare bones, except for a few poems. I do want to read the Primo Levi poem because if you're thinking of adding just one poem to your traditional Haggadah, I think this is an incredible one. I'll share it. Passover. Tell me, how is this night different from all other nights? How, tell me, is this Passover different from all other Passovers? Light the lamp, open the doors wide, so the pilgrim can come in, Gentile or Jew. Under the rags, perhaps, the prophet is concealed. Let him enter and sit down with us. Let him listen, drink, sing, and celebrate Passover. Let him consume the bread of affliction, the paschal lamb, sweet mortar and bitter herbs. This is the night of differences, in which you lean your elbow on the table. Since the forbidden becomes prescribed, evil is translated into good. We will be spending the night recounting far off events full of wonder. And because of all the wine, the mountains will skip like rams. Tonight, they exchange questions, the wise, the godless, the simple-minded, and the child, and time reverses its course, today flowing back into yesterday, like a river enclosed at its mouth. Each of us has been a slave in Egypt, soaked straw and clay with sweat, and crossed the sea dry-footed. You too, stranger, this year in fear and shame, next year in virtue and injustice. It's amazing, right? It's really amazing.
Yeah, and the text of that is in the chat box. Thank you to Dina for posting a link for those who are interested in adding that in that poem.
Lex, thank you. I just want to thank you so very much for hosting and pulling us all together. I'm really incredibly grateful to you.
No problem. It is my absolute privilege. I love this book. I'm not just saying it for, like, this is, I literally have it right next. Oh, yeah, you can see, Zoom is being funny, but I have the book right here. It is generally pretty close to wherever I'm sitting right now because.
By the way, a wonderful actress has recorded it on as an audiobook.
Oh, amazing.
And I could imagine, I mean, none of us are driving anywhere, so you're not going to listen to it while you drive, but it could be nice to listen while you clean for Passover. I mean, as a thought.
True. Yeah, audiobook. Yes, and we're going to try to have the proper links to audiobooks and ebooks. Keep your eye on the chat, and also keep an eye on our Jewish Live page. We're going to try to shout out to all those different modalities.
So you know what I'm going to do right now?
Sure.
I'm going to replace my mug with a champagne glass.
Oh my gosh.
And I think Peter and I, my husband Peter and I, we're going to raise a cup of champagne.
Amazing.
You see, Peter's leaving his room in the house. I think he's going to go get the champagne in the fridge.
Great.
And we're gonna raise a cup together. And I encourage you to find some reason to celebrate today. Also, I hear the refrigerator opening. Just bring it over. No, we're not going to open it up, but I just want to show it to you. I just want to show that I'm a woman of my word. Yes. So we're going to take out some champagne.
That's amazing.
And if you are not alcohol, we also have a non-alcoholic festive beverage. So l'chaim to everybody.
L'chaim, and I'm assuming for those interested, split it into 4 little mini cups in honor of the Passover Seder and the Haggadah that does so. But thank you so much, Vanessa Ochs. There were a couple other questions that were in the chat box that we didn't get to. I'll forward those to you and maybe give you a chance to be in touch with the folks who initially
That would be terrific. Happy to do so. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you all
so much.
One more shout out on my little Zoom window, bit.ly/Haggadah bio, capital H, capital B. That will get you to Vanessa Ochs's book. You can buy it online through the Princeton University site with a 30% discount. Ochs30, OCHS 30 is the code. I believe all capital letters on Ochs, although I'm not sure if it's case sensitive. But please go ahead and buy it, read it, listen to it, whatever modality works for you. It's a sensational book. And Vanessa Ochs, thank you as always for bringing your wisdom, bringing your teaching, and dare I say it, bringing your Torah to Jewish Live.
Thank you, everybody.
All right, we're signing off.
Wow.
Stop.